Guys, it's Will from the Game Lounge, and I've been away for a few weeks, a mix of illness and just taking some time off of YouTube, but I have been doing a few projects in that time, and one of the key things that I've been doing is my Dreamcast. You can see it's seen better days. It's yellowing despite being stored in a cupboard for the majority of the time, and it sounds like a foghorn in terms of how loud it is. So the disc reader also is occasionally just not reading discs, and I looked at picking up a new one and it was about £100. So I thought about this for a while and then thought, well, actually there's a number of great upgrades for the system, and I figured, could I for $100 or £100 upgrade my Dreamcast to the ultimate Dreamcast? So I set myself a challenge. Now, I normally play probably 90% of my Dreamcast games through emulation because you can upscale the graphics, the emulation is excellent, they look really good, but the Dreamcast is a strange system where it actually had a pretty high resolution output and it still looks great on a CRT, and where I can, I like to still keep my original hardware to play games, but the convenience of emulation is one of the big things that keeps me going back to that. However, nowadays you can effectively hack and modify consoles. There's so many great things you can do. So I was looking at this and I thought, right, what do I want to do with my Dreamcast? And I guess I set this challenge basically as a bit of fun. I am not that great when it comes to actual hardware modifications. You know, I watch YouTube videos very closely. Normally things go wrong. I remember trying to solder my original Xbox and I ended up frying the board. So this is really just a little bit of a fun passion project to see what I can do for what is now a very cheap sum of money. People used to talk about $800 Ultimate Dreamcasts and $400 Ultimate Dreamcasts. I had an HDMI Dreamcast for a long time until I sold it, and I sold it for nearly £400. So this is going to be really interesting how far I can get with just £100. Now, £100, which is the rough cost for a decent condition Dreamcast, doesn't get you that far, but the first thing I needed to do was reshell it. So I found a great black shell for less than £20 on AliExpress. I also found the GDEMU optical drive emulator, and this is great because it brings that convenience factor back to the system. If you have that though, you also need to replace the PSU because otherwise the Dreamcast can overheat. So a DreamPSU, which uses a lot less power, a lot less heat, was better. For cost reasons, that meant the HDMI mod was out of scope, but I did find one of these Bitfunk's HDMI adapters, and I'm hoping that will do the job using the VGA output. And you can see here it all arrived from AliExpress. I even went one little step further and got a great logo, and with the couple of pounds extra I had left, I picked up an LED and a new replacement battery, which obviously would need to be soldered. But if we have a look at the bits here, it's all turned up. Took about 2 weeks from AliExpress, so I think as long as you use a reasonably reputable seller. I also bought a new Dreamcast badge just to make it look really authentic. And these are the tools that I use. Now, let me be very clear, I am terrible at modding things. When I replace graphics cards in PCs, nothing seems to go back the same way with wires. So I have got a solder, but I wanted to do this, what I wanted to do was show that even someone who is a complete novice with this sort of thing can actually turn the Dreamcast into a great system. So let's show you here, and I'm going to speed this footage up here, but let's take a look. Let's take the shell apart and see exactly what we're dealing with. And you'll see here, it's just 4 screws. You can just pop the modem off of the side and you're straight into the console. Very simple, and it's a very elegantly laid out system. And you can see here, I'm going to be replacing obviously the optical drive. This huge thing on the left is the power supply. That will all be going. You can see the battery at the front. Mine is dead, which is frustrating. The only thing that I'm going to try is not replacing the fan, but that is something that you can do if the console stays too loud because of that fan. So again, let's start by taking the the disk drive out. This should be fairly straightforward. Again, it's just 3 simple screws. And I think so far so good. We're now going to take the power supply out. This looks fairly straightforward. Again, it's just a few screws. So let's give this a go. And just disconnect the power cable and give it a wiggle. And this came away very, very easily. So far so good. Everything seems to be going to plan at least. You can see a sheath of plastic that just basically keeps the disk drive from touching the power supply, so I'll keep that just in case we need it later. But the power supply hopefully should just slide away. So next I'm going to remove, try to look at removing the actual board. Let's start obviously with the power connector, which is again just a couple of screws and a cable. And then let's look at removing the controller ports. Now this is actually the, shall I say, flimsiest and I think one of the more perilous pieces to remove. I found it to be quite difficult to get the screws loose, and yeah, it then needed to be really wiggled and shaked out to just get it off. But thankfully, again, reasonably straightforward, but I do think this is something where you just have to take a little bit of extra care when you remove this. And then it's fairly straightforward. Remove the fan. Again, that's just 2 screws. You can see actually disconnecting this from the controller port board is actually also a little bit tricky. I ended up using just a tiny thin screwdriver just to disconnect that, which is not that simple. I actually leave it in here for now, but yeah, just a tiny screwdriver just to slightly lift it up so it can come out, and that's absolutely fine. So then that leaves us with essentially just the board, the main power of the Dreamcast, the actual motherboard. And again, this is all very, very well insulated. There's a metal sheath underneath, and it's all just a case of 5 screws that should then just pop out, which I had absolutely 0 issues with this either once it comes out. And that's actually it. We are done. You can see this is the metal sheathing inside. Now, one thing that's actually worth a mention here, and I didn't realize this until after I completely wrecked my Dreamcast, but you need to look on the bottom and just have a look for this 1. You can see this is a PAL. Apparently, you can only add the GD-ROM optical drive emulator if you have this 1, but here it is in all the flesh. This was less than £20, and I've got to say I'm incredibly impressed with the quality of this and just how good it looks. You can see I always wanted a black Dreamcast. I know that there was a Sega Sports one. It was very, very expensive to get your hands on back in the day. So to actually be able to have a classic black Dreamcast is pretty exciting to me. And everything here is incredibly well printed. It feels very, very premium. Certainly not cheap at all, despite the cheap price tag. But let's literally do everything that we've just done in reverse. So starting with the metal sheath, going back in, and then we'll add the Dreamcast motherboard back. And again, the biggest advice I can give here is just take your time with these things. There is nothing difficult about what I've done so far. It is just about being methodical. You know, I made sure that I kept all of the screws, organized, ordered, took pictures regularly. Obviously, I'm filming this so I could refer to that footage if I needed anything. I'm sure most people out there are far more technical than me, but actually this was pretty easy the first stage is obviously very easy. When you start thinking about the new components that are obviously different to the existing ones, you'll see I make a ton of errors. Thankfully, none that are critical. So once the board is back in, again, keep going in reverse. Let's get the power switch back on. And then let's put the fan back in and obviously the controller port. Now, this is the bit where I actually have to admit failure, because I did have a go at trying to solder, and what I was trying to do was replace the battery. Now, unfortunately, the battery that I bought was not the rechargeable battery. It was just for the single-use batteries. So when you look here, I was all ready to solder and started taking it out when I realized that actually I didn't want to use the replaceable batteries. I would rather have a new rechargeable battery that only has to be changed every 10 years or whenever it goes. So I actually abandoned this idea midway through. It's something that I might go back to. And then, yeah, a little bit of wiggling to get that controller port back in. And obviously now we have to connect this ribbon back in, which just needs, you know, really solid, strong hands just to push it cleanly in. Most people disconnect it from the controller port board. I actually disconnected it from the Dreamcast motherboard. I don't think it hugely matters. I didn't have any problems getting it back in, as you can see. So up to this point, everything has been very, very straightforward. It's simply been reversing what we did on the way out. However, next step is to put the DreamPSU back in. Now you'll see it's about a quarter, maybe a fifth of the size of the PSU, simply because it no longer needs to power a moving optical GD-ROM drive. It simply needs to power the GDEMU. So we can use this and hopefully this will be no problem at all. But get ready for some comedy, because you can see here the first thing that I do that is completely wrong is I put it on this way, which sort of looks right. It seems to slot in, but what you'll realize is that this wouldn't fit if I put it this way down with the optical drive. So don't make the same mistake as me. Don't put it on upside down, because yeah, you'll see very, very shortly I get incredibly confused and realize it needs to go the other way up. And here we go then, we're on to the star of the show, which is the GDEMU optical drive emulator. And you'll notice I also bought the 3D printed casing for it. And I've got to admit, actually, I'm pretty impressed by that. The fit is great, the quality feels good. So let's have a look at this and let's get this installed. And this is where I realized my mistake. You can see here where I'm trying to fit the GDEMU board in. Very, very shortly, I cannot get this in properly. And after some mass confusion, eventually I realized this is not the way to go. So best thing is obviously to fit the board to the 3D printed casing first, which you can see I do here. However, you can see the SD card extender here. It pushes right up to the plastic, which is fine. It worked, but it didn't exactly feel that great. I would have rather had a little bit of breathing room in there, but it all goes together quite simply and looks pretty good by the end of it. And a couple of screws just to push it tightly together. And you'll notice that, yeah, like I said, it looks great. It fits nicely. It just slots in and doesn't really look too out of place. You know, I went for obviously the same color as the shell, and you'll see once the shell's all reassembled, it looks like this is the way the console should always have been. But again, a few screws to simply fix it in, and really no problem. This was the trickiest thing about this, was just assembling the 3D printed case, and then it screws back in exactly the same way as your standard GD-ROM drive. So, of course, I'm going to leave this part in where you can see me desperately grappling and trying to work out exactly why the power supply doesn't fit, and having numerous issues with it until I ultimately realized that it is, of course, upside down. And rather embarrassingly, this took me far longer than it should have taken me to work out. And confession, I even had to look up a video in confusion until I realized in the video, okay, it's turned up the other way, and that's how it's pressed on, which gives you obviously loads of space, loads of air that can flow through, no problem at all. Notice I didn't put the sheath back in because I don't really think it's needed anymore, unless, you know, you were looking to guide the air, but I don't think it's going to be that critical. Now, I do have to be honest, one of the unexpected, most complicated things was actually getting the plastic off of the modem and then putting it back on. I really struggled with this. You have to sort of push it and the plastic is about to break but then snaps into position. All I can say if you ever do this is just persevere. You will get there in the end, but it's not necessarily a fun thing to do. So that's it now. Everything is back in and I've got to say it looks great. I'm really happy with the 3D printing. You've got the reset button here and it all feels very premium and I'm extremely pleased. There's only one thing to do, which is to obviously put the case back together. And I've got to say, for a sub £20 console case, it feels great and it certainly has given my Dreamcast a brand new lease of life. Now, of course, there is one thing left to do. This obviously has no SEGA branding, so I'm going to put on my custom printed sticker onto the front. And I have to say that this just finishes the whole thing. I deliberately bought one with a black background and it just slots into place. It looks great and I've got to say overall could not be happier with the look of this item. Really, really pleased. And I have to say, overall, I think if we compare the original yellowed, horrible looking console to this, it looks premium, it looks fresh, it looks new. I'm so happy with how this has turned out. If anybody's on the fence about doing this, as you can see, it's super easy, but we've still got the software to think about. And booting it up, you'll actually hear the one problem. Now, I still have at this stage the original stock fan, and I guess I'm going to at this point admit defeat in my £100 challenge because the fan is still far too loud. You can literally hear it from other rooms. Let's have a listen. So I've gone one step further with a new Noctua fan. Now it is slightly larger, so you also have to buy, and again this just came from AliExpress, a 3D printed holder for it. And it means going back, opening the console up, you can see the fan on the right hand side here. Very, very easy to remove to get started. And I've got to say, this actual 3D printed kit, I'm not sure if there are different versions out there, but this one certainly feels a little cheap. And the issue that I have with that is not so much the fan holder, but actually you have to replace, because the fan is slightly larger, you also have to replace the clip on the CD tray. And that definitely doesn't fit as well as the stock one. It's definitely a bit clunky when we look at it. And you'll see here, you have to effectively replace the stock plastic, as I say, you use the same spring, but it's with rather cheaply assembled 3D printed plastic, and it just doesn't feel as good. Like I say, when you open and when you click the CD tray, it's not perfect, and that could be my installation, to be fair, but it definitely doesn't feel that satisfying click when you close a CD tray. It does feel just a bit clunky. And of course, there is the software element, and GDEMU and Open Menu actually now are very, very easy to configure. There's a GDEMU manager, and it is quite simply click and drag with the latest versions. There's no need, it will automatically organize your games into alphabetical order and the folders. It's all click and drag and very, very straightforward to get working. I'll pop some links in the description to the software that I used, but within 15 minutes I was up and the SD card was all prepped and I was ready to go. And here it is now, running in all of its glory. And I have to say, the menu is fantastic. And have I managed the £100 cap? Well, not quite. I decided to go one step further with a fan, and also let's remember I've slightly cheated because I had an existing 256GB SD card which I've used. So yes, it costs slightly more, but let's compare the difference between the Dreamcast, the stock Dreamcast without a GDEMU menu, and having to use all the discs that was yellow and basically unusable, borderline popping it in the bin. For the same cost of replacing it, I've upgraded it, and I have to say I am really happy with the result. I have not stopped playing this. And of course, the first game I'm going to play is of course Grand Theft Auto 3. A game that has only just been released on the Dreamcast. And you'll see this is one of the more recent builds of the game, and it runs so well. It really does get you thinking, what if this game had been released for the Dreamcast back in the day? But I'm going to show you some footage now. All of this footage is captured from real hardware, running from the GDEMU, and I have to say, like I say, it still holds up. I'm really impressed. I'm so happy that I've done this. And if anybody is getting into a bit of console modding or trying to refresh their old hardware, this is definitely the way to go. The console lives on. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. You can see from the footage here, it really looks great, even today, all these years later. Like I say, it's good to be back. Like, subscribe, and have a great day.